Since the first title in the series was released in 2007, the Assassin's Creed games have been using historical events in order to tell an alternative history narrative with sci-fi elements. While this does inevitably mean that the games often take wild and nonsensical departures from accepted historical facts, the success of the series suggests that Assassin's Creed games serve as an introduction to historical events and figures for many people. As of 2019, the series has sold over 140 million copies to some 95 million unique players, which would indicate that many people's understanding of Renaissance Italy, the American Revolution and the Peloponnesian War was informed by the events as depicted in the series. 2020's entry to the series, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, focuses on the Viking conquest of Britain during the late 9th century. Therefore, it turns its, and by extension the players', eyes to the often misunderstood historical subject of Vikings. The Viking Age and the activities of Norse and Danish clans has long been of interest to the modern English-speaking world. George Webbe Dasent is generally considered to have introduced Norse mythology to the reading public with his 19th century translation of Scandinavian folktales, such as The Story of Burns Njal, published in 1861. This trend was also observable around Europe, with German composer Richard Wagner's operas arguably creating the modern visual template for Vikings. However, this romanticised and long-lasting depiction of Vikings, which closely ties Dane and Norse settlers to Norse mythology, is an oversimplification of a complex people. Elizabeth Ward, an expert in the material cultures of the Viking Age, suggests that recent studies have revealed a complex view of the Viking past, at odds with the simplistic popular stereotype. She goes on to identify the horned helmet as a fitting emblem of this disconnect, given that while a lot of people would recognise these helmets as ubiquitous with Vikings, there is no evidence that Norse settlers ever wore helmets like these. In reality, the Viking invasion of Britain was not driven by intangible ideals of glory, by Viking warriors' desire to earn their place in Valhalla. Rather, Viking expansion was driven by far more complex socio-economic factors. While there is much debate over what these factors were, the issue of population density in Scandinavia was a major factor that has some credence. Robert Ferguson suggests that the mountainous terrain of Scandinavia was not able to support the agricultural needs of the growing Norse population, creating the need for many clans to leave their homes in search of new opportunities. Archaeologist Julian Richards explains that Britain, which had previously been a target of Viking raids during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, soon came to be seen as an ideal location for colonisation. This was due to a combination of its proximity to Scandinavia and its agricultural potential. Furthermore, during the 9th century, the British Isles were divided between a number of warring leaders, meaning that it was particularly vulnerable to invasion. While the title and aspects of the marketing campaign would suggest that Assassin's Creed Valhalla had opted to portray its Viking characters in a simplistic manner, seemingly more inspired by recent films and television shows than real history, the game presents a relatively nuanced view of Viking settlers. While the game still relies on themes inspired by Norse mythology, such as destiny, fate and glory, and manages to shoehorn in a daft sojourn to Asgard, it goes out of its way to present its Viking characters as colonisers. While the player character, Eivor of the Raven clan, does journey to England in search of glory, their voyage is also motivated by a desire to resettle their clan. The player character leaves Norway after Harald Fairhair subsumes their clan into his newly unified Kingdom of Norway, mirroring the historical trend of displaced Norse leaving Harald's kingdom for Britain. After this point in the game, the theme of colonisation becomes interwoven with the gameplay, with the player tasked with improving and expanding their new home village. By tying this historical trend to the gameplay mechanics, Assassin's Creed Valhalla reinforces the reality that Viking settlers in Britain were not simply aggressive interlopers, but complex, often displaced people seeking a new home. The geographical reasoning for 9th century Scandinavians settling in Britain is also emphasised by the game's visual design. The early areas of England that the player explores are lush and verdant, the British countryside tattooed with farmlands and idealised villages. In contrast, the explorable area of Norway that is offered to the player is, while beautiful in its own way, desolate and wintry. This leaves the player with the firm impression that they are not simply in England to raid monasteries and set villages on fire, but to build themselves a new home away from home. The Assassin's Creed series has always weaved real historical figures into its own alternative history fiction, often with mixed results. At its worst, this tendency can undermine the achievements of these historical figures by conflating their successes with nonsensical magical MacGuffins. A glaring example of this would be the portrayal of Napoleon Bonaparte in 2014's Assassin's Creed Unity. Often, historical fiction focuses on recognisable historical figures in order to reach a wider audience. Hilary Mantel, perhaps the preeminent writer of modern historical fiction, explained in her 2017 Reith lecture, The Day is for the Living, that her earlier work that focused on marginal historical figures only reached a small and select group of readers, which did not grow until she decided to march into the middle grounds of English history, the Tudor monarchy, and plant a flag. The Viking Age represents similarly middle-of-the-road, popular fare, so how Assassin's Creed Valhalla explores the central figures of this era and connects them to its own mythology is crucial to differentiating it as good or bad historical fiction. The predominant historical figure of the Viking Age is surely Ragnar Lothbrok, particularly after this character was chosen to be the protagonist of the recent soapy and fantastical TV series Vikings. In this series, Ragnar is depicted as the archetypal Viking raider, a peerless warrior who yearns to explore and conquer new lands. However, in reality, Ragnar Lothbrok probably did not exist, with the historian Catherine Holman arguing that there is no evidence that Ragnar himself ever lived, and he seems to be an amalgam of historical figures and literary invention, much like King Arthur in the British canon. In this sense, Ragnar Lothbrok is the personification of the horned helmets described by Elizabeth Ward. Mercifully, Ragnar is not featured in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. His sons, however, who Holman asserts were real historical figures, do feature, to typically mixed results. Hálfdan Ragnarsson, one of the leaders of the great heathen army that invaded Britain in 865, is featured in the game and presented as one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. However, this is questioned in the game, with one character seemingly disputing his claim to be Ragnar's oldest son. Not only does this introduce, potentially for the first time to many players, the idea that Ragnar Lothbrok was a historical invention, but it also shines a light on the ways in which Viking leaders may have gained power in the 9th century. By associating themselves with deceased legendary warriors, current leaders could further their own claims on thrones and lands. There is some evidence to suggest that the real Hálfdan himself attempted to do this, when he raised his claim to the throne of Dublin by associating himself with Ragnar's other sons. While the game does use Hálfdan to shine a light on the historical processes of the Viking Age, its interpretation of Ragnar's other sons is less successful. In the game, Ivar the Boneless is depicted as a lithe and effective fighter, whose moniker derives from his fighting style. There are many theories as to why the historical Ivar was given the name Boneless, ranging from his being born with a physical disability to his potentially being impotent. Ferguson suggests that the word boneless is in fact a mistranslation from the Latin word for hated, which would make sense given his activities in Saxon Britain. However, the game's interpretation of this nickname seems to be primarily influenced by Ivar's depiction in the 1969 film Alfred the Great, rather than any credible historical source. Additionally, Ivar is portrayed in the game as a simplistic Viking warrior obsessed with glory, Valhalla and blood eagles, totally devoid of more complex motivation. The depiction of Ragnar's sons demonstrates that to some extent Assassin's Creed Valhalla wants to have its cake and eat it when it comes to depicting 9th century Vikings. It wants to show that they were a complex people that traded and colonised throughout Europe, but it also wants to include the hammier, more recognisable elements of Vikings in pop culture. Therefore, its attempts to be historically accurate are constantly undermined by the influence of more contemporary depictions. An altogether more successful incorporation of a recognisable figure into historical fiction can be seen in the game's portrayal of Alfred the Great. As the pious king of Wessex, who sought to unify the Saxons into one English kingdom, Alfred is often presented as the villain in Viking pop culture. This is also the case in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, however it is the way that Alfred is integrated into the Assassin's Creed lore that is most impressive. The game depicts Alfred as the founder of the Knights Templar, and while this is not true, the real order was founded by the French knight Hugh de Pan some 200 years after Alfred's death, the reasoning for Alfred's decision is informed by what we know about him from history. In the game, Alfred seeks to destroy the Order of Ancients, a shadowy cabal of influential officials who worship what would have been perceived as pagan relics, and reform them as an organisation with Christianity at its heart. The monk Asa, who wrote a contemporaneous biography of Alfred, notes that the king collected a book of psalms and prayers that he brought with him everywhere for the sake of prayer and was inseparable from, highlighting how important his faith was to him. By incorporating elements of historical record, such as Alfred's steadfast Christian faith, into the ongoing narrative, Assassin's Creed Valhalla allows itself to build upon the lore of the series whilst also staying true to what we know about these historical figures. Furthermore, when working with the player character, Alfred goes under the pseudonym of the Poor Fellow Soldier of Christ, a moniker inspired by the original name of the Knights Templar, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Again, by grounding its own fictionalised narrative in tangible historical details, Assassin's Creed Valhalla achieves a sense of credibility and cohesion by adhering to accepted facts. While Assassin's Creed's presentation of historical figures and events has often been hit and miss, it has always shone when it allows the player to become a virtual tourist in its lovingly recreated historical locations. Valhalla is no exception, and its 9th century British setting makes it particularly interesting to people like myself who live in England. I grew up in London and I went to university in Leicester, so it was personally fascinating to visit these locations and see how much they've changed. The dominant landmarks presented in Valhalla are often churches, many of which no longer exist. For example, the Saxon cathedrals at St Paul's in London and St Martin's in Leicester depicted in the game were replaced following the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Assassin's Creed Valhalla allows players to experience locations they may be familiar with, such as Leicester and London, in a whole new way, transporting them to a state that is lost to history. This aspect of the game is similar to contemporary interdisciplinary history projects, such as City Witness, Place and Perspective in Medieval Swansea, which uses historical testimony, maps and archaeological evidence to recreate a digital approximation of Swansea as it may have been in the 14th century. While the Assassin's Creed series has been transporting players to its recreations of long-lost historical settings since it first released in 2007, in recent years the series has endeavoured to present these settings in a more overtly educational light. The previous entry in the series, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, set in ancient Greece, introduced a new game mode called Discovery Tour. This mode included 30 guided tours of its locales, which each include optional quizzes. This mode, which is scheduled to be included in a free upcoming update to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, allows players to avoid the alternative history plot and instead focus on the peoples, events and landmarks of 9th century Britain, in a way that is surely more engaging than most museums. As I have said in a previous video, this is the true strength of depicting history in video games. By immersing the player in an interactive historical environment, they can engage in the past in an incredibly tactile way and learn at their own pace. This is an aspect of the medium that I would personally love to see expanded further upon in the future. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is by no means the most egregious use of Vikings in recent pop culture. When compared to the 2013 television show that arguably popularised the period in recent years, Valhalla certainly presents a more nuanced view of the Vikings, presenting the people as a complex group of settlers who are not simply interested in conquest and glory. Equally, the game represents a step forward for how the Assassin's Creed series uses its historical settings and characters, weaving individuals and events into its alternative take on history without compromising on historical authenticity to too great a degree. However, it also demonstrates the limitations of presenting historical settings within the context of a popular mainstream video game. While it may offer players a captivating and well-realised take on 9th century Britain, it is a take that is influenced just as much by modern interpretations and sensibilities as it is by historical records and archaeological finds. Hopefully, as the series progresses, it will continue to expand upon its educational modes such as Discovery Tour to ensure the line between fiction and history is not blurred in the minds of its players. I hope this video has taught you something new. If there are any questions, please leave a comment or reach out to me on Twitter. If you require further assistance regarding academic writing, history lessons or English comprehension, you can find my tutoring profiles below.